Berenstain opens with a quote from Audre Lorde that I think is actually one that we've already come in contact with. And it's this idea that Black and Third World people are expected to educate white people as to our humanity. Women are expected to educate men, lesbian and gay men are expected to educate heterosexual women. The oppressors maintain their position and evade their responsibility for their own actions. There's a constant drain of energy, which might be better used to redefining ourselves and devising realistic scenarios for altering the present and constructing the future. And I think Berenstain's opening here is quite well articulated already, so I don't think there's much that I can add to it to make it any more succinct and straightforward. So I'm going to go ahead and just read the introduction for you. It's only a couple paragraphs. So the phenomenon that Lorde, Britta Schwartz, Morrison, and many others have identified and criticized is what I term epistemic exploitation. Epistemic exploitation occurs when privileged persons compel marginalized persons to produce an education or explanation about the nature of the oppression they face. Epistemic exploitation is a variety of epistemic oppression. It's marked by unrecognized, uncompensated, emotionally taxing, and coercive epistemic labor. It maintains structures of oppression by centering the needs and desires of dominant groups and exploiting the emotional and cognitive labor of members of marginalized groups who are required to do the unpaid and often unacknowledged work of providing information, resources, and evidence of oppression to privileged persons who demand it, and who benefit from those very oppressive systems about which they demand to be educated. So this is ubiquitous. It is common within institutions of higher education, activist coalitions and alliances, and interpersonal relationships. Despite its pervasiveness, however, it is not widely recognized as a component of epistemic or social and political oppression. Rather, it masquerades as a necessary and even epistemically virtuous form of intellectual engagement, and it's often treated as an indispensable method of attaining knowledge. Epistemic exploitation goes by many other names. Standard conversational norms allow epistemic exploitation to masquerade as any number of acceptable and normalized practices. Quote, exercising harmless curiosity, just asking a question, making a well-intentioned effort to learn, just offering alternative explanations, and playing the devil's advocate. These are a few of the labels used to describe epistemically exploitative interactions. These innocuous euphemisms all help to mask the oppressive power dynamics at play in instances of epistemic exploitation. That many of these euphemistic covers frame epistemic exploitation as virtuous epistemic practice related to the pursuit of truth is one reason that the practice is both widespread and vigorously defended. So this creates a burden on the marginalized to educate and enlighten. Though the privileged demand the epistemic labor of the marginalized, they often perpetuate epistemic oppression by dismissing the knowledge that's produced. The marginalized are excluded from the realm of recognized knowledge creators despite contributing novel conceptual resources and epistemic frameworks. The rhetorical obfuscations surrounding epistemic exploitation make the naming and explication of the phenomenon critical to developing strategies of resistance to epistemic oppression. As the insights of Lorde, Britta Schwartz, and Morrison indicate, the practice of epistemic exploitation has long been acknowledged and critiqued by women of color activists and scholars. But despite the level of attention and discussion that it has received in these intellectual spaces, epistemic exploitation remains under-theorized within academic philosophy. While the expansive literature on epistemic justice details a number of ways in which structural power determines the distribution, attribution, and social dimensions of knowledge, it has yet to explicitly analyze this particular phenomenon. And that's the task of this paper. So there are three main features of epistemic exploitation. The first is unpaid labor and opportunity cost. The second is the double bind. And the third is default skeptical responses. So let's start with unpaid labor and opportunity costs. So Black folks, in the case that she's talking about, are required to provide extra and unacknowledged labor, time, and resources to institutions that white colleagues do not have to. And they have to help struggling students of color navigate those institutions and ensure diversity at the levels of faculty and administration. So this can happen by being required to be on committees and attend meetings so that their underrepresentation can appear better represented. BIPOC bear a disproportionate burden when it comes to mentorship and advising, and unfortunately, this work rarely leads to institutional change. And here's a case where white folks benefit and perpetuate systems of oppression, and then turn around and ask the oppressed to educate them on those systems without good compensation. And this compensation can lead to a debit or a tax on marginalized people that can be incurred through years unlived due to the psychological distress that it takes and the additional labor that is taken to dispel that distress when explaining to a privileged person or the oppressor the nature of one's own oppression. There is an increased cognitive and emotional load carried by those who are subject to oppression. And additionally, one will often see that work is dismissed by those who demand it. Thus, it diverts energies from marginalized communities that could be used elsewhere in tangible ways against oppressive systems. So that's the opportunity cost part. So there's unpaid labor, it's a lot of work, and then it's work that one could be doing that could actually be changing oppressive structures. Because the privileged feel entitled to the time and energy of the marginalized, if Maharal fails to provide the labor expected of her, she will be seen as shirking a duty and thus will open herself up to reprobation. So marginalized persons do not have the option to simply engage without being subject to harm as a result of their perceived affront. So marginalized folks have little possibility to choose to engage with an epistemically exploitative demand of sharing about what it is to be oppressed without fear of what might happen if they refuse. So the case that she gives is this one. The existence of the double bind means that there is little possibility of a marginalized person choosing to engage in an epistemically exploitative demand without fear of what might happen if they refuse. So you're compelled to do so. Consider the following situation in which a marginalized person faces a double bind when confronted with an epistemically exploitative demand. Suppose Amina, a black woman, is out with a white male acquaintance, Ben, when a white woman approaches her, reaches out to touch her hair, and exclaims how soft it is. Amina tells the white woman not to touch her hair. The white woman, offended, says, "I was just trying to give you a compliment," and leaves angrily. Ben then asks why Amina was so rude to the woman who is just being nice. Amina is tired and does not feel like defending her right to bodily autonomy or explaining the history of white objectification of black women's bodies and the racist entitlement that it is inherent in a white person's touching a black woman without her permission. However, Amina knows that if she refuses to explain herself to Ben, or simply says, "I don't want to talk about it," she runs the risk of being painted as overly emotional, irrational, hypersensitive, unfriendly, and aggressive. Amina thus faces a double bind. She can either engage in the coerced labor of explaining why the white woman's action was racist and justifying her response to it, or she can risk being seen as confirming the misogynoiristic, controlling image of the angry black woman. If one does engage, if one does provide the educational labor requested, that can actually leave one worse off and more vulnerable than before. And this happens even if the privileged person accepts and acknowledges the explanation, simply because of the kind of labor that's required. Furthermore, the answers are rarely ever enough, or maybe never enough. If one points out problems with racist structures, one's required to additionally provide solutions to those racist structures. So one might complain of their oppression, and then the rejoinder is, well, then what is the solution to it? Which moves the goalpost from identifying and criticizing systems of oppression to now having to solve the much more difficult issue of providing solutions to it And it seems that the implication is if you don't provide solutions, then it can't be true that you are subjected to some kind of marginalization. One cannot then simply be sad or complain or be critical. Harmful stereotypes are ready to be deployed against marginalized persons, no matter how they respond to epistemically exploitative demands on their time, labor, and expertise. And that's what constitutes the double bind. As well, once you share, you might face default skeptical responses. These skeptical responses are default about the experience actually happening, or that the experience is part of some larger pattern of oppression. There's skepticism in the objections that malice or conscious intent is needed for something to be oppressive. There might be objections about the scope of the problem or the way that it intersects with other identity markers. And this skepticism ultimately tends to just serve the oppressive status quo. So a privileged person is generally in a less favorable circumstance to assess the legitimacy of someone's experience of oppression. By responding with skepticism, she implicitly suggests that she is as qualified as the oppressed to evaluate what counts as, say, an experience of racism. Privileged folks also tend to set the terms of the debate. So if someone objects to the framing, then they're perceived as losing. And this can lead to a further loss of credibility, compounding the marginalized credibility deficit that they already experience. These skeptical responses can result in gaslighting, as when one gives a banal explanation for the overly sensitive perceptions of the marginalized. It can also result in testimonial smothering, which is the self-silencing in which a speaker avoids engaging in risky conversations with the hearer who is incompetent or unwilling or unable to give the appropriate uptake of the proffered testimony by the marginalized. So how does this all relate to epistemic injustice and epistemic oppression? Well, epistemic exploitation can intersect and offer the trigger for further epistemic injustices, like testimonial injustice. So consider the situation in which a female graduate student, Summer, denounces the role that sexism played in her department's decision to award all available fellowships to male graduate students. Despite the graduate program's international reputation as a hostile place for women, a male graduate student, Dean, demands that Summer explain to him how the fellowship decision is sexist. She responds by noting that the department harbors a high number of male faculty who are serial harassers, that these faculty serve on the fellowship committee, and that the committee generally fails to award merit-based fellowships to women. Summer points out that the chair of the department knows about the harassment, but covers it up in order to protect the department's reputation, and he continues to let the harassers serve on the fellowship committee. She also relays personal experiences of sexual harassment by male faculty who are committee members. Dean responds by insisting that Summer misinterpreted her experiences of harassment by committee members, and he says that the real harassers are just a few bad apples, incapable of genuinely affecting departmental climate. He asserts that fellowship distribution is meritocratic, and that gender bias played no role in the department's decision. He discredits Summer's claims by saying that she is just resentful about not being awarded a fellowship, and is therefore blaming sexism for an outcome that was caused by her own shortcomings. So this case demonstrates a number of intertwined epistemic harms. Dean epistemically exploits Summer by demanding that she educate him about an aspect of oppression that she experiences, in this case, the department's sexism. When she does provide him with an explanation, he dismisses her claims. His default skeptical response to her experiences of harassment functions to demand further epistemic labor from her. Dean gaslights Summer by telling her that she is inaccurately interpreting her own experiences of harassment. He also perpetuates testimonial injustice by subjecting her to the negative stereotype of the bitter woman crying sexism and using that to undermine her credibility. So this is an instance of a broader pattern in which members of marginalized groups are less likely than privileged persons to be ascribed the credibility they are due. And this is particularly true when it comes to claims about the nature of their own oppression. So we could draw an important lesson from this case if we contrast how Dean responds to Summer, with how he would respond to the same claims if they were instead made by another male graduate student, Ryan. Dean would be more likely to accept the same explanation of departmental sexism coming from Ryan than he was from Summer. The nature of this privilege is that it comes with a credibility surplus. Privileged persons are more likely to believe claims about privilege and oppression when they come from other persons who share their privilege. So, since privilege comes with a credibility surplus, and this has ramifications for how effective enlightening the privileged epistemic exploitation can be. Because of testimonial injustice, educational labor is often going to fail. And this is why the privileged must act in solidarity with the oppressed and take it upon themselves to educate other members of the privileged group. So that's testimonial injustice. What about Fricker's hermeneutical injustice? Well, epistemic injustice generally occurs when the conceptual resources for educational work already exist. In those cases, willful hermeneutical ignorance and contributory injustice are going to be compounding factors. But backing up, if a privileged person demands work from an oppressed person, and this is in the background context of hermeneutical injustice, then because of that, the marginalized person does not have the options that even create the double bind, because there are no shared interpretive resources available for them to educate the privileged. More frequently, it happens that the conceptual resources are available, but they're not taken up by the privileged. Contributory injustice results from a subject's willful, ignorant use of structurally biased hermeneutical resources in a way that compromises another's epistemic agency. So they fail to circulate that information, and it's not a matter of failure of creation. So this is slightly different than an alternative case in which dominantly situated persons try to erase or deny the existence of some relevant hermeneutical resources. So this is one of the functions of default skepticism. The willful hermeneutical ignorance is the tendency of the dominantly situated to dismiss epistemic resources, such as, for example, date rape or heteronormativity, by making fun of it or dismissing it in some other way. That makes sense of experiences and phenomena that are primarily discernible to the marginally situated. So this is a denial to take advantage of the epistemic goods that are produced by the marginalized. If this occurs, how could the privileged possibly think to learn from their demand of marginalized people? And if it's not for learning, then what is the demand doing? And this is where the concept of epistemic oppression comes in. Epistemic oppression is a persistent and unwarranted infringement on the ability to utilize persuasively shared epistemic resources that hinders one's contributions to knowledge production. So what is this? Epistemic oppression is really characterized by the sustained, unjustified compromise to the epistemic agency of some marginalized community or population. The privileged demonstrate entitlement to the labor and the means of production of knowledge by the marginalized. So that's work done by the marginalized, but then in turn fail to recognize the goods that are produced by that work as actual contributions to knowledge. So she remarks, or she draws from Charles Mills's conception of white ignorance. That's, I think, first discussed in the racial contract. But here, we can think of it in the context of epistemic oppression. So to uphold systems of white supremacy, white folks engage in white ignorance. White ignorance is a form of ignorance that masquerades as knowledge, which is in turn mandated by white supremacy. So this works by white supremacy encouraging its beneficiaries to meet a set of standards of cognition about the way that race functions in the world that create a tacit agreement to misinterpret the world. So we always interpret black folks as criminals, or black folks as lazy, or black, whatever the stereotype. Black folks as a threat to white women. Black folks as having different brain size or something, if you follow racist science of phrenology. So you look at these capacities between different communities. You say white people have these higher level capacities, Marginalized communities do not. They have non-whites have lower capacities, and this distinction is natural. And that justifies, or it tends to justify, systems of white supremacy. But ultimately, all of those stereotypes and those claims are a misunderstanding, a misinterpretation, an evasion, or a self-deception on matters related to race. So whites must maintain a coherent narrative of racism. They must engage in this willful ignorance in order to make sure that white supremacy persists. That's the kind of story. So this system requires the construction of a narrative on which dismissing the resources offered by the marginalized appears reasonable. So this coherent narrative of racism or oppression that requires the construction of a narrative in which it's okay to dismiss the marginalized concerns as not being rooted in rationality or reasonableness, to deny their contributions to our hermeneutical space. By demanding and rejecting conceptual and epistemic goods that the marginalized produce, they erase practices of epistemic resistance by those marginalized communities. So, the epistemic products of the labor of the marginalized then play an important dialectical role in the disinformation produced by dominantly situated knowers. The epistemic products of the labor of the marginalized are treated as fodder for skeptical responses, which are then harvested for the development of straw man arguments against the marginalized. It makes debate seem reasoned or balanced, but where active ignorance always emerges as the rational victor. So this is the issue that she sees with epistemic exploitation. It is a species of epistemic oppression. It provides grounds for hermeneutical injustice and testimonial injustice, and it functions through unpaid labor of opportunity costs, through the double bind, and through default skeptical responses. All really for masquerading as reasoned debate or something, but for the purposes of uplifting systems of oppression. So there's an example, I have a video called What is Sea Lioning? And sea lioning seems to be a very similar phenomenon, where it's a presentation of an open for debate and learning, when really it's not. This is one maybe more sophisticated interpretation of what's going on there.